Hello, and welcome to Author Talk on ASA Presents.net. My name is Brian Snyder, and I'm the Marketing Director here at ASA. I'll be joined shortly by Arlynn McMahon, pilot and author of Lesson Plans to Train Like You Fly. Arlynn will be presenting the value of using lesson plans to train like you fly, not just to pass the test. So without further delay, let me introduce you to Arlynn McMahon, author of Lesson Plans to Train Like You Fly. Arlynn is a graduate of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. She has an MBA in Strategic Leadership from Amberton University, and she worked as the chief instructor at Bluegrass Airport in Lexington, Kentucky. Arlynn was the 2009 National Certified Flight Instructor of the Year. She won the NATA Award for Excellence in Pilot Training. She's a retired DPE, an ATP, an FAA Gold Seal instructor, a CFII, MEI, and AGI. Arlynn has over 9,000 hours of dual instruction given, and she's flown in all 50 states. She has over 12,000 accident-free hours. So, without further ado, please meet Arlynn McMahon. You have the controls, Arlynn.
Thank you, Brian. What a joy it is to be here tonight with everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information. I'd like to welcome everybody out there in the audience, whether you're here live with us tonight or if you're watching the archived edition. My hope is that by being here tonight, you'll pick up at least one good, useful idea tonight. We have a lot of information to cover, so let's get right to it. Train like you fight and fight like you train. When General Patton told his troops that, what he meant was that they should train in the operational conditions in the environment that they were going to be fighting in. But as pilots, the whole world is our environment to be operating in. Why, as a pilot, you might train for your pilot certificate in the Caribbean, but then that pilot could take her fishing poles and her airplane to Alaska and do some flying and some fishing. And as an instructor, it is nearly impossible for us to train a client in every single environment that they might want to work in. But what we can do is we can simulate different environments. We can provide rehearsal in the way of scenarios. And we can make sure that they've correlated enough basic information so that they'll be a safe and good pilot no matter where they decide to fly. Using scenarios and training like you fly makes better pilots. And I can prove it. For more than 40 years, my husband and I owned flight school in Lexington, Kentucky. And over the years, that flight school accumulated more than 500,000 flight hours. And in that time, nobody ever got hurt. That is quite a legacy that I am proud. And I'm hoping that tonight I can share with you how we did that so that you can have a legacy of your own. Let's start by looking at the agenda tonight. What we hope to do is to look at some of the skills and attributes that go beyond the check ride that make a good pilot. Then we'll figure out how to work those attributes into our lesson plans. And then finally, we'll talk about how to implement those lesson plans into the curriculum. Whichever curriculum you happen to use, you don't have to change curriculum. You can do it right now, right here with a curriculum that you're presently using. Please notice the photo on this page. This photo was taken from a real flight in a Quest Kodiak. The Kodiak is an airplane that missionary pilots fly in. Now, just in case you're not familiar with the Garmin display, all that red on the screen means that the terrain is at a higher altitude than what I was flying at this day. Missionary flying is on the extreme. This is a unique environment to be in, and there's really no way that an instructor can prepare somebody to be in this kind of environment, but that doesn't mean that we can't try. But before we can talk about training pilots, we have to start with a discussion about what it is we're trying to accomplish. What do we want our pilot to be able to do? What kind of pilots do we want to turn out? As instructors, do we want pilots who can pass a test? Well, yeah, sure we do. But if you're the training pilot, is that what your goal is? To pass the test? To just pass the test? I don't think so. Most pilots I know, especially the ones carrying families and friends, they want to be the best pilot that they know how to be. So what skills do they need? Do they need the same skills as a missionary pilot? No, I don't think so. So where is that balance? Well, that's up to you. It's up to you to decide which skills beyond the check ride a good pilot needs. Now, you might think this discussion is silly, but let me just remind you that nowhere does the FAA define what a good and safe pilot is. What they define are the certification standards, the minimum to pass the test. If you were in school, what grade would be the minimum to pass the test? A D. I don't think any pilot is going to spend the time, effort, or money to be the worst pilot that they can be. So let's look at the photo on the screen. Yes, folks, that is a piece of cheesy pizza. And by now you're wondering, what does pizza have to do with what we're talking tonight? Well, let me just ask you a question. Have you ever bought a frozen pizza, bought a home, unwrapped it, and before you stick it in the oven, add a little extra cheese? Maybe some jalapenos and mushrooms? Oh, yum, doesn't that sound good? Well, those extras, that's what makes it uniquely yours. And that's what makes it good according to your palate. And we are going to do the same thing to our pilots. We're going to add extras. What you see here on the screen is my list of extras. These are the attributes that I think are good for making a good pilot that go beyond the check ride. Depending on your environment, your list might be different. And that's okay. I'm presenting my list here primarily because as we go through some lesson plans, you're going to see my attributes and how I worked them into the lesson plans. So let's go through my extras one by one real quick so that you can figure out what I'm trying to say here. My first extra is that a pilot be proficient in positive control of the airplane. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if the altitude assignment is 3,000, then that's the goal, 3,000, or getting back to 3,000. But what it's not is plus or minus 100 feet. Number two, I teach minimum controllable airspeed in flying. Now, yes, we practice slow flight for the check ride, but for teaching purposes, I like minimum controllable airspeed because I think a pilot can only feel confident in his airplane when he's experienced it through the entire performance envelope. He learns that the machine responds consistently to consistent control inputs. That's just two examples, but I think you're getting the point. The next, pilots need to be comfortable using technology, but not reliant on it. Let's face it, technology is everywhere. It's the way we fly today, and so therefore it must be included in the training. But we don't want pilots to depend on their technology to the point that they don't develop basic skills, and that's why sometimes we have to turn it off. Next, pilots need to be confident in a wide variety of environments and situations. That could be geography. It could be a different airplane. It could be different airspace, or maybe it's just a new level of technology. Have you ever had problems after you've downloaded a new level of technology? Plus, the pilot must be able to handle multiple situations simultaneously. Have you ever been in a situation where you were maybe just outside your comfort zone? Maybe the visibility was really low when you accidentally pushed the wrong button on the GPS. Oh man, I hate when that happens. But we have to practice that. We can't allow that stress and panic in the cockpit to build that accident chain. Next, pilots must be experienced in making aeronautical decisions. I'm going to tell you now, back when I was a student pilot, and yeah, that's been a few years, the number one cause of accidents was pilot error. And unfortunately, it's pretty much the same today. We've not made a lot of progress in this area. We have to do things different. We can't just talk about aeronautical decision making. We have to give them experience in making decisions. We have to give them experience in making mistakes. And we have to give them experience at bailing themselves out of those mistakes when that happens. We have to stop telling pilots what to do and start asking them, what do you think you should do? Pilots need to be respectful of flight privileges. To be respectful of flight privileges means that a pilot approaches a flight with a business-like attitude, even if it's their hobby. Their actions are deliberate. He approaches each flight, each phase of flight with a certain thoughtfulness. And last, pilots are accountable for their actions. Do pilots make mistakes? Hell yeah. But we have to own them. We have to learn from them, and we have to strive not to make the same mistake again. So let's look at how these attributes might be incorporated into a lesson plan. This would be a lesson plan that a new flight instructor might need to give on an initial check ride. I've chosen one just to use an example. This is the emergency approach and landing maneuver, just as an example. Now, I know that this maneuver is not the routine in our flying, but I chose it tonight because there are so many elements that go into it. In my world, each element, each maneuver is introduced with a drawing because it's visual. The Aviation Instructor's Handbook is clear to say that most people only remember about 15% of what we hear, but we remember about 88% of what we hear and see. And that, in my opinion, is a very good argument for why we have to draw the maneuver when we're teaching it to the students so that they're able to see it. And as we go through here tonight, I'm going to be including some excerpts from my book just so that you can see the way the lesson plan is presented in the book. On this page, you can see that each lesson begins with an introduction, and as part of that introduction is a scenario. Now, a scenario could be a made-up story, or it could be something from the instructor's past. Oh, don't try to read all the stuff on the screen. That's not why I put it up here. I just wanted you to be able to see what it looked like in the book. But I think that pilots need to know why what you're telling them is important, because if they understand that it's important, then they'll be more motivated to learn it and to give it their best effort. Once the introduction is made, then we're ready to get started with the big picture. Before we get into all the details, the pilot has to have overall the big picture. What is this maneuver? Very simple. Now, if you look on the right hand, that squiggle, that is my attempt to draw the emergency descent spiraling down over the emergency landing. Yes, folks, I am not a Picasso, but believe it or not, students learn to fly just like this with something very basic and simple. Now, after he's got the big picture, then you can start bringing in some detail. And in the maneuver world, we call these elements. There are certain elements of the maneuver that the student has to know, and we have to start explaining those elements. We have to explain them in a way that's organized. We have to explain it in a way that makes sense. And we have to make sure that each individual element applies to the big picture of the maneuver and how to make it a success. One nice thing about doing it this way is you can take it step by step. And that way, the pilot doesn't get overwhelmed. He's able to digest the information in bite-sized pieces, and he can see along the way how he might need to make decisions as the maneuver develops. As we get more into the detail, as we get more into what is supposed to happen, we can identify for that pilot the decisions that happen, but also how those decisions might need to be tweaked as the maneuver develops. You've all been there. You thought you were going to land at this field, but whoops, we have to make an adjustment. It takes a while to learn that, but that's okay. Now, at some point, the maneuver is going to come to an end. The problem is a lot of these maneuvers have more than one way for it to end. So how to get out of the maneuver, the recovery of the maneuver, is the next thing that needs to come so that the pilot can understand how he's going to recover and make the best choice. What we're developing here is a pilot who can see what he's supposed to be doing and what he's supposed to be thinking about. And next comes the why. In my opinion, it's important for instructors to explain the why. Just as one example, in this particular maneuver, we often tell pilots not to make the 180-degree turn back to the airport should the engine fail on takeoff. But unless you draw it for him, unless he can see that it's actually more than a 180-degree turn, unless you sit there and do the math with him, he'll never get it. But if you go through this once, I guarantee you he will never forget it. And that's the beauty of drawing it and going through it and letting him digest it in small pieces in a way that they understand it. Risk management. It's a buzzword these days, but it's actually more than that. Now, I know in most curriculums, risk management is a standalone ground lesson, but actually it needs to be part of the flight lesson. Every maneuver has risk associated with it. As the instructor is communicating with the pilot what the risks are, that instructor is reviewing the risk management for himself, reminding himself to manage the risks during practice. How many accidents involve practice? So for everybody to have their head on straight when the engine starts is a good thing. Also, you notice on here something I call the 10-20-30 rule. It's a device that I use to help clients to recall how to divide their attention. I didn't make it up. It's been around forever, but just in case it's new to you, I'll go through it real quick. 10 seconds out of every minute should be spent inside the cockpit, performing cockpit tasks, such as verifying the engine monitors or updating the GPS or scanning flight instruments. 20 seconds out of every minute should be focused on ground references, the changing terrain, updating the distance from an obstacle, or maybe just keeping that flight path parallel to the runway on downwind. And then 30 seconds is focused on searching for traffic. Now, that's not to say that 10 seconds consecutively is being done for this, and then 20 seconds consecutively is spent on that. No, it's not that. Of course, we're doing many things at once. It's just a simple way to remember how to prorate your time when you're in the cockpit. It's part of the risk management. We're having a delay here in my slides. Wit and wisdom. Those are those personal insights, those stories from the instructor. Students love flying stories. I have to tell you that years later, students will come back and say, well, I remember that time when you told the story about, and let me tell you, they can recap that story with great clarity and detail. I even have students call me and say, let me tell you what happened to me today, because I want you to share it with your students so that they don't make the same mistake I did. Now that is what I call pilots paying it forward. So when I hear a great story that illustrates an important point, I make a note on my lesson plan so that I remember to share it in the future. Now on the screen, you're seeing a real photo of a flight school airplane. The pilot made a successful emergency landing. He did total the airplane, but he walked away from the accident with one scratch on his forehead. His headset sort of dug into his forehead a little bit. But you can bet that every one of my pilots see these photos. It doesn't get any more real than this, and it certainly brings home the point that you want to sacrifice the airplane in order to save the people. Now, of course, no lesson plan is complete without a discussion about minimum standards. Now, this excerpt is not the entire standard. I just put it up here to remind me to tell you about talking about standards. I don't mention standards to the applicant until we're in those final 3 hours preparing for the check ride. And why is that? Well, I've already taught him how to do the maneuver correctly. If he does the maneuver correctly, then he doesn't have to worry about the standards. If anything, the standards just show him how poorly he can fly and still pass the check ride. It's just not necessary in my book. Another required item is the common errors. This is another testing thing. The FAA wants to make sure that the instructor knows what the common errors are. But invariably, the typical flight instructor wants to share them with students. My fear is that simply talking about them will manifest them because suddenly that's what the pilot's thinking about. For that reason, I choose to talk about the common errors in the positive. I like to rebrand them to keys for success. And that way, the student has a positive learning experience. We can talk about everything in a positive way, and it just keeps things more fun and upbeat. As an instructor, I like that. So there you go. One lesson that I give, how I give it. This is what the lesson looks like by the time I finish drawing it. And hopefully you can see how I incorporated the attributes of making my good and safe pilot. If you think back about the levels of learning, for you flight instructors out there, the levels of learning, you remember rote, understanding, application, correlation. Well, guess what? The student is already at the application level before you even leave the classroom. Now, as an important note, I draw the picture in front of the customer because he needs to see the maneuver develop. I would never draw it ahead of time and just give it to him as a handout because then he can't digest it in those bite-sized pieces that we talked about. Now, you can draw it on the whiteboard if you want to, but a better idea is to draw it on paper. And after the lesson, turn the paper over on the back and make your debriefing notes on the back. And then after the lesson, give it to the student. And that way he can carry it home. And that way he has the lesson with the finer points on it. He also has your debriefing notes. Don't forget to put your phone number and name on there. And that way the student remembers who the best instructor in the area is. The student will be that much more prepared for the next lesson. I have a whole complete set of drawings that I keep for myself, my master set. It's helpful for me as an instructor because sometimes I don't teach all the maneuvers all the time, and it helps me to keep things fresh in my mind. Brian, what do you think? Would you love an instructor who gives you a signed piece of art at the end of each lesson?
Absolutely. Why not? I mean, it's a useful piece of art, if you can call it that, for sure. Absolutely.
Do we have any lessons out? Do we have any questions?
We do. We have a few questions. Let's start with this one. Do you find technology to be a plus or minus when it comes to primary pilot training?
Yes. You have to love the one you're with. And when it comes to airplanes, you have to train to the airplane that the customer is training in. And yes, it's a plus, and yes, it's a minus. Technology doesn't keep pilots from making mistakes. It only ensures they're making different kinds of mistakes. So it's up to us as instructors to augment our training to what and sometimes the technology includes.
Okay, sounds good. There's a comment here from William. He loves your survival guide, which I grabbed a copy of and displayed behind me here as well. That's probably topic for another story, but I'm sure you have lots of stories from that. I've read that, and they are fun, entertaining, frightening, and exciting all at the same time. So,
a day in my life.
How do you balance teaching students about the dangers of flight without scaring them? New students.
Life is dangerous. Getting out of bed is dangerous. We don't walk around all day talking about dangers. We turn around into a positive, and we talk about what we should be doing and what we can be doing. And if we approach flying the same way we approach life, then we're going to be raising up healthy, happy pilots.
Sounds good to me. One more question before we continue. Can you give tips on how to handle a student who maybe shouldn't be a pilot?
First, I would start by getting a second opinion. Sometimes students and instructors are like oil and water in the cockpit, and we have to make sure that it's not the interaction between the student and the instructor. But if a second instructor also feels that way, then we as instructors have a duty to that customer and to the industry to help them take up knitting or sailing or something else.
Okay, fair enough. All right, well, that's about all the questions we have right now. If you want to jump back in, we can continue.
Very good. And you bring up a good point there, and that is that a lot of the topic that we're talking about tonight is about student pilots and about initial training. But the reality is that even experienced pilots appreciate an instructor who can explain a maneuver clearly, who can make it real, and who can help them to become the best pilot that they can be. Everything that we're talking about tonight is applicable to flight reviews and aircraft checkouts and the other training that we may give. Now, you'll probably find that you need to develop some new teaching tools to facilitate your expanded lesson plan. So let's talk about a few possibilities. And what you see on the screen right now is the radio aid. And this is important because every new student gets mic fright, and I think every instructor is scared to be called out by ATC for an inappropriate radio call. Both fears can be eliminated with something as simple as a tool to guide the new pilot in routine communications at your airport. And very quickly, you'll find that the student is able to develop a in-command demeanor on the radio when he's got some confidence in using a tool like this. Now, even if you train at an uncontrolled field, there's no reason why you as the instructor can't simulate being ATC and give your pilot a preview of another environment they'll soon be flying in. Another tool that comes in handy is the scenario database. There we go. The scenario database is very good those times when the lesson might otherwise be canceled, maybe because of weather or for maintenance. And basically, it's just a list of, if this happens, what will you do? For most of the scenarios, there shouldn't be a right or wrong answer. Most shouldn't be relevant to a specific regulation. It should be a tool to allow the student to think through all of the options, weighing all the available information, and making the best choice. The scenario database is a tool in thinking. And yes, your students will wish sometimes that there was another option, and that happens in life too, but we have to choose the best option for what we have. Now, as an instructor, I like seeing how the pilot thinks. I'm confident in soloing a student. I'm more confident in sending him out in a solo cross-country situation when I know how he thinks and how he makes decisions. And during the discussions, of course, I offer my insights. Just remember, you want to draw out his thinking. You would never say, well, what you should have said was this. You would say, why didn't you choose this option? And once again, coming at him with questions. Diverting to an alternate is one of the more difficult things to teach, and it can be a ground lesson, and a very effective ground lesson. All that's needed is a chart and a scenario and 3 alternate airports that the pilot could choose to land at. But the big thing about the diversion exercises is that we're going to time him. Timing, just like in real life, it adds stress, it adds pressure. So you tell the student, you must make the decision as quickly as you can. Now, let me tell you, the first exercise, the student is going to be in agony for several minutes. But by the time he gets to the 3rd or 4th one, he'll be able to evaluate very quickly what information is important and what information he needs to make the decision. And soon, he'll be making pretty good choices based on real reasoning. And by the way, these diversion exercises, they came from a guy, his name was Dr. David Hunter, and he's now retired, but he was with the FAA Human Factors Office. And just in case you didn't know about it, there are many offices within the FAA. These are expert people who are very excited to help you teach pilots how to be good and safe pilots. So if you're having trouble teaching something, teaching anything, just think through which office that might apply to and give them a ring on the phone. I think you'll find that they are very excited to talk to an instructor who's wanting to do a good job. Next up is a tool that I'm going to call the decision tree. And the reason is because sometimes the answer to a question or a problem is complicated. And it's easier for the customer to see the branches of thinking. It helps them to think through the problem. And again, just as one example, involves an operative equipment. That this is a multifaceted answer question, but it's much easier for the customer to go through here when asked the question, is this airplane airworthy? So again, it just allows him to take it step by step and think through it. So lots of times, a decision tree is something that will help your customer. At this point, we have discussed a few attributes that are needed, perhaps beyond the check ride, to make that good and safe pilot. We've talked about lesson plans and maybe some training tools you might need to help partake your information to the student. And now what we want to talk about is how to include these lesson plans into our curriculum. So now we're going to talk about enhancing our curriculum. And honestly, the best way to do this is with a scenario. Now, I'll warn you, the FAA's definition of a scenario is a little bit different than mine. In my opinion, a scenario is any real-world experience that represents the way the pilot will use this information on a typical flight. The scenario doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to let the student see what's at stake and what forces are behind the decisions that he needs to make. So let's look at just a few examples on a typical private pilot check ride, and I think you'll see very quickly what I mean. And of course, first up is the first flight. Let's just start him right out of the saddle. As instructors, of course, we're going to get them off the ground. We're going to give them a few minutes to enjoy the scenery and to learn the effects of the flight controls. And then, as an instructor, I point to the river below and I tell them, I would like you to follow this river. Try to anticipate the bends and curves. When it bends sharply, I'll need you to turn steeper. And when it bends gracefully, well, then you can make a more shallow turn. But be mindful of the altitude and try to stay at 2,000 feet right here on this altimeter. This allows the customer to control the flight, not just the plane, but the flight. He's aware of the terrain features beneath him and the obstacle, like that big power plant right over yonder. When returning to the airport, the instructor points to the city ahead, and the pilot is told to climb to a higher altitude. And now that customer is aware of the difference between flying over the rural area of the river versus the congestion of the city. And when it's time to dial in the ATIS and head back to the airport, the instructor would turn to the customer and say, "You have been doing such a fine job. Why don't you control the airplane while I get our clearance?" And I guarantee you that pilot is going to sit up straight, he's going to smile, and he is going to feel proud to be in control of that airplane. Now, it's a simple scenario, but it is a fun first flight. And it allows the pilot to control every aspect of the flight in a controlled situation, but he's also learning some very basic concepts so that, again, he can get that big picture. He's experiencing situational control. This is much different than the average first flight experience that I've heard about at other places. Which one would you choose? Let's look at another one. No, not that one. I pushed the wrong button. Here we go. Lesson number 3. Take me to the runway. You see, by lesson number 3, the customer is probably comfortable with the routine of pre-flight inspection and checklist and starting the engine and taxi to the hold short line. So now it's time to take all those individual aspects and bring it into one bigger picture, and for putting the pilot in command. The instructor explains, take me to the runway. You know what to do. I'll be here if you need me, but I would like to sit back and let you do it on your own. Now, let me tell you, this is a difficult lesson for the instructor as well as the student because it requires the instructor to sit down and shut up. Yes, the student is going to make mistakes. Have some patience. Let him work through them. Unless an incident is imminent, let him have the time that he needs to work through the problems. All of a sudden, you're going to see where additional training is needed, and he will see it as well. At some point, I guarantee you, the pilot is going to be uncertain, and the instructor is going to feel the urge to jump in and to save him from his uncomfortableness. Don't do it. Don't do it. Teach your customer to ask for help. This is an important lesson. Asking for help using all your available resources. But when the day comes that he is able to taxi by himself all the way to the whole short line, be sure to give him a big smile and a big high five and celebrate. Now, let's just review real quick. Do you remember my list of extras? Let's go down the list. Did we see positive aircraft control? Was he using his technology? Was he developing confidence in his new environment, in his situation? Did he have the opportunity to make decisions and to make mistakes and to bail himself out? And do you think he feels some pride and some respect in his privilege? This is lesson number 3, mind you, and we are already on our way to making a good pilot. Let's do one more. Somewhere around lesson 9 or 10, the student is already familiar with several maneuvers, and it's time for what we normally refer to as a review lesson. On this lesson, there's no new information coming at him. We're just going to review. So the instructor might say something like this. I want to talk to you about our flight lesson next Saturday. Now, I know that's 3 days away, but I have an assignment for you. And it might take an hour or two, so plan some time, okay? I need you to think about this flight. The scenario is this. You and I are going to assist the Civil Air Patrol in searching for a little girl. She was last seen near a red barn right here on the chart. Now, I've taken the liberty of putting in a waypoint in the GPS called Red Barn. So you will take off and navigate to our waypoint. And once we have the actual red barn in sight, we'll need to circle around it 2 or 3 times to see if we can find the little girl. Now, you'll need to remember windage because we want to stay over the red barn. And I'm going to be taking some photos. So you want to be as low of an altitude as possible so that we could possibly see the girl in the photos. I'll let you choose the altitude that you think is appropriate. And then we're going to proceed over to Tiny Town Airport. You can use the autopilot if you like as you prepare to enter the traffic pattern and land. We're going to drop off these photos so that the CAP can take a look at them. Now, there's going to be a lot of other traffic in the area doing the same thing. So you might want to slow down as we start getting close to the airport. I'll let you make that decision. And then on the return flight home, we're going to be doing an S-turn across the interstate until clear of the search area. And then I'll let you bring me home. Now, before Saturday, I need you to give some thought on how you're going to accomplish this flight as the pilot in command. Now, of course, I'll be there to help you and help you over the rough spots, but I think you're comfortable with what needs to be done. It's just a matter of you figuring out step by step what you want to do and how you want to do it. Now, I ask you as the audience, considering my list of extras, can you see how everything is beginning to work together here so that we are making a pilot that is a good and safe pilot? Yeah. So there you have it. Training like you fly is not difficult, but it does require some good lesson plans. Training like you fly results in good and safe pilots. They're far superior to the average. You might be sitting in the audience right now asking yourself, where do I go from now? So I want to leave you with a call to action. If you are an instructor, get out of the practice area. Take your students out to the real world and let them experience the whole world as their practice area. That's where they're going to be flying. Commit to training, thinking safe and good pilots. And if you are a pilot, perhaps some things that we've talked about here tonight will give you some talking points and better prepare you to interview instructors so that you can find one to train like you fly. Brian, how are we doing on time? Do we have time for a few more questions?
We're doing great, Arlynn. Yes, we do have some time for some questions. One, speaking to your extra list, which you just mentioned again, how did you arrive at your extras for each lesson? or how did you arrive at your extras list?
I think that comes from experience. I think after years of banging my head against the wall, sometimes when the training was finished, I would ask myself, would I allow my little sister to fly with this pilot? And I always felt bad if I wouldn't be excited about my little sister flying with him. And so I just started thinking about, what pilot would I want my little sister to fly in? And I think that's key, because if you'll let a member of your family fly with your pilot, then maybe other family members would fly with a pilot. But it's an exercise that requires some soul searching on your behalf. And that list is going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty personal list, something that's important to you that you want your students to learn that might not be in a book.
That's exactly right.
Okay, another question. How do you recommend for CFIs to keep up with all the new avionics?
Oh, I got to tell you, that is a tough one. And I struggle with that almost on a daily basis. I think after a while, you do kind of learn avionics as a system. In other words, once you learn one Garmin, you can pretty much get in and figure out the other Garmins. The real problem comes in moving from Garmin to Avinon or another system completely. And then at that point, you're going to have to get into the books. You're going to have to learn it yourself. And I like to keep notes and cheat sheets and checklists. I have a card for each make and model of airplane that I typically have flown. I have cards on the avionics, the autopilots that I've flown, just so that I can sort of pull this autopilot, this GPS, whatever's in the cockpit, and put together a card for the flight for today. And then I can kind of get those numbers and that information back in my head. But again, a lot of that's going to come from experience. And don't feel embarrassed about telling your pilot that you're not familiar with a piece of equipment. Pilots can sort of sense when an instructor is faking it. So I suggest that you not do that. Nobody knows it all. You do the best you can, and then you solicit help from other instructors, from other people that you trust, and don't be afraid to tell the customer, especially if it's a customer-owned airplane, that, hey, I've never seen this piece of equipment before. Tell me what you normally do and how you normally do it, and it'll be okay, I promise.
Great. Okay, how do you work with a pilot who has much more experience than a new instructor for a flight review, for instance?
I actually had that situation early on in my life. I had not been an instructor for very long when a Delta ATP pilot retiring came to me for a flight review.
Did I read that story? Did I read that story in here?
I think you did, as a matter of fact. The important thing to remember is that you have something to bring to the table. When somebody comes to you for instruction, they're wanting new information, new ways of thinking about things, new ways of doing things. So don't feel overwhelmed or intimidated because of hours. You probably have more hours in this airplane than your pilot does. He might have more total time than you do. You might have more hours in this geographic location than this pilot. He may have more total hours, but if this is the first time he's flying in Alaska, I guarantee you he's going to need some help. Everybody has something of value to bring to the table. Just get started with him. Just go with your heart, go with your brain, ask him questions of what he expects, what he's looking for, what he wants, what he needs, and service the customer in your most authentic way. And again, it will be okay. If he's an experienced customer, he knows he doesn't know it all. He knows you're new, and that's okay.
Great. Okay, a couple more questions. I think we have some time for a couple questions. This one, where can one find the scenarios database that you mentioned? Is that something you created, or is it something that's in one of your books, or?
I did create it, but I created it with the help of my friend, Dr. David Hunter from the Human Resources Office. So here again, you have to seek out people that you respect. So one of the things that I did was all over the airport, I went to experienced pilots and I said, tell me stories that have some learning aspect that I could share with pilots. What decisions do they need to make? What did you wish that you knew? And it took me about a year to develop a database. I started with a database for pre-solo, and that was relevant to what would I expect from my students if they were out on a solo flight and something happened. And lo and behold, one time I did have a student out flying solo, and suddenly they closed the runway because there was an accident on the runway. That student pilot then had to go to another airport and land. Well, thank goodness we had been to one of those other airports in one of our scenarios, so he knew how to get there, and he knew how to land, and he knew to call home, and I drove and picked him up. So first is, again, deciding what you want in your pilots, and then seeking out help in making those scenarios. And there are a lot of scenarios in the book. There's probably 3 or 4 pages of scenarios. So hopefully I gave you enough of a variety to where you could get some ideas off of them.
Another question along those lines, Cynthia asks, do you also provide the cheat sheet cards you made?
Those cards are called TOLD cards, TOLD, takeoff and landing data. And just about all of the universities, the military, any institution has TOLD cards. And I promise you, you don't have to recreate the wheel. If you'll look for a TOLD card for whatever make and model you're flying, you'll probably find them. Now, there are some things on those TOLD cards that I don't care anything about. I've got other information I'd rather have. So you might have to personalize them for you, what's important in your environment. But if you'll look for TOLD cards, I think you'll find what you're looking for.
Okay, great. All right, one last question, and we'll wrap it up. Is there a particular point at which you introduce instrument failures?
Early. It might be an instrument failure because I'm covering up technology stuff. Let's face it, these days, a lot of the technology is linked in with a lot of the instruments. So I would say about the time they're getting comfortable using the instruments is when I want to start taking them away from them, because I don't want them to get dependent on them. I like them looking out of the airplane. I would say that's probably somewhere around lesson 3 or 4. I start my people early on everything, the good and the bad and the ugly.
All right, sounds good. All right, and to wrap this up, I might be able to answer this question. Hi, Arlynn. Would you kindly share with us a link to your lesson plans brochure so we can download it? Thank you. Now, I don't think you have a brochure, but you got a book, right?
You betcha.
All right. So we'll provide the URL for you where you can get that book. It's an ASA book. You can buy it from ASA or online retailer or at your FBO. They're available in multiple places. So, well, Arlynn, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. I think you did a great job. I know you did a great job. I think we had some interesting questions here. And thank you so much for providing this introduction to your book. And thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody, for spending time with us.
All right. Thank you, Arlynn. Have a great night. Thank you for joining ASA Presents. We hope you found it helpful, informative, and educational. Take care.